Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're here with another video to help you improve your chess game. If you haven't told your friends about my channel, please take a couple minutes and say something at your local club or something. That would be great. If you haven't subscribed, you can do that. Of course, you can like any video that you like. All right, today we're going to talk a little bit about the geometry of tactics. Now, we've talked about this a little bit in the past. I have two prior videos on my channel called The Seeds of Tactical Destruction, and I think more about the seeds. And seeds of tactical destruction are something that's wrong with someone's position that tells you that there might be a tactic for you. So the seeds are what's happening in the person who's going to be the victim of the tactic, and then the other person looks for the tactic. Now, you can't have a tactic if your opponent doesn't have seeds, but if he has seeds, it's possible you don't have a tactic. For instance, in my book, Back to Basics Tactics, I have a whole chapter where all the patterns, all the positions in the chapter have seeds for one side. Let's say black has something wrong with the position, but in only half the puzzles in that chapter does white actually have a tactic. In the other half, he can't take advantage of the seeds, and there is no tactic. But when you see those seeds, it tells you this is an opportunity to look for a tactic. It's not wasting my time. Maybe there's something there. A good example of a seed, the most important seed, according to Dr. John Nunn, the Grandmaster, is loose pieces, and leads to the famous LPDO, Nunn's dictum, which is loose pieces drop off. But a lot of the seeds have geometry to them, and in this video we're going to concentrate on just the main seeds that lead to geometry, or geometry leads to the seeds, I guess I should say. And we'll start with seeds along the file and rank. When there are loose pieces, let's say, along a file or a rank, or even not loose pieces, it tells you that if you put a rook or a queen on that file or that rank, you might get either A, a double attack, B, a skewer, or C, a pin, depending on what the geometry is. So let's go through those cases here. Let's take a couple of black knights and just throw them on the D file. All right, the E file. If we throw the knights on the E file, that tells us we can skewer those two knights by putting a rook on the file. So if we have a rook on H1, we're going to look at playing rook to E1, or maybe it's a queen that we're putting on the E file. If we move those knights a little further away, let's put one on E3 and one on E6, then we have the possibility of not only skewers on E7, E8, E2, and E1. If we have, let's say, a rook on H2, we could play rook to E2 and get a skewer. But if our rook's on H4 or H5, or anywhere on the 4th or 5th rank, we could go in between, and now it's not a skewer anymore. Now it's a double attack. We have the same seed, the two loose knights on the E file, but if we could put a piece in between them, it's a double attack. And if we put a piece on one side or the other, a rook or a queen, then we've got a skewer. Now, if the knights are in such a way that the geometry says they can guard each other, then it might not work. For instance, now we've changed the geometry to where there's guardable squares on F5 and D5. So if we play rook to E1, I can move either knight to either square. We have 4 moves we can play that would save us here, because even though the geometry tells us there's a seed, there's 2 loose knights on the E file, the geometry also says that the knights are exactly at the right distance apart so that they could move and guard each other. So again, we've got geometry talking to us here on what we could do. Now let's take a look at a pin. A pin would involve one piece that's worth more and the other one being worth less. So let's use a king, because those are absolute pins. This is a famous geometry. We've got a knight on the file, and we've got a king on the file, and that means if we put the rook and the queen in between them, we've got a double attack. But if we put it on this side of the knight, then we have a pin. Now let's say the knight is somewhere else. Let's put it over here, and let's put a pawn over here and a on D7 and a pawn on D2. Now we've got this pin again. Let's say rook on H1 to E1, and he has the defense of playing D5, And now we use the AWL idea, attack with something worth less, because the rook is worth more than the knight. So the fact that we pinned it wasn't good enough because he could guard it. But now we can AWL the knight with d3, and we're winning the pinned knight. So if there was no pawns on the board, then we could just pin the knight and win it. But if there are pawns, then we have to look and see if we can keep attacking the knight in such a way that we can win it. I remember a game where one of my students who was fairly low rated was playing at one of the big tournaments, and he couldn't win with like a queen. He had like a queen and 2 pawns against a rook, and he kept trying to like check the other guy instead of like queening a pawn and winning the rook, and he kept losing his pawns because he would chase the king around the board and the king would take off the pawns. And finally he couldn't win, and he just wanted to get a draw, and he offered the guy a draw, and I think the guy said no. And let's say he was black, and they finally got to some position like this where it was white's turn, and white played check because he had the skewer of the king and the queen, and there's our seed there with the right geometry, and black resigned because he knew he couldn't win, and yet he had been trying to get a draw, and he resigned because of the skewer. And of course in this position black could just move his king back. The geometry is that the queen is within two ranks of the queen, and the geometry tells us that when you skewer somebody like that, you're not winning the whole queen, you're only winning the queen for the rook. And if he had just moved his king back and guarded the queen, then after rook takes, king takes, he would have gotten the draw that he wanted anyway. But he resigned because he was so frustrated that he got his king and his queen skewered that he didn't look for the geometry of at least getting the rook for the queen and saving the draw. So he ended up losing the game, believe it or not, even though the geometry should have told him that it should have been a draw. All right, so we can play with all kinds of examples here. For instance, let's put a king and a rook here. Well, when it's a rook and a king, we can't go in between them with a rook and double attack them and win like we could if that rook on a5 was a bishop or a knight. But we can still skewer them on g5 or h5. So here we have a rook skewer similar to what we just looked at on the 5th rank, and the king cannot go back and guard the other rook. He's too far away. Again, the geometry tells us that if the king was on the c file or the b file, on c5 or b5, we could still skewer him, but then the king could retreat and guard the other rook. It's the fact that the geometry tells us that the king and the rook are separated by a bigger distance that tells us that when we skewer him, he's not able to guard the rook. So we have these same ideas. And again, just to repeat it really doesn't matter whether this piece was a queen or a rook. I still have the possibility of skewering him here. Now later on we'll look at some double attacks with the queen that involve moving in different directions, not just on a rank or on a file. We call, using the rank or the file, we call that orthogonal because it's vertical and horizontal together, which is orthogonal. All right, so let's take a look now at diagonals. We have the exact same kind of things happening on diagonals. Let's put a king and a rook on the diagonal. This tells us that if we can get a queen or a bishop safely to one of these squares, then we can get a skewer of the king and the rook. So here, for instance, if white has a pawn on g5 and he has a bishop on d8, we can play bishop f6. There's that skewer, and even though the king is only two diagonal squares away from the rook, he can't move to any of those diagonal squares to guard the rook, and he's going to be losing an entire rook with this sequence. Now, does the bishop have to be there? Well, no. We could have put the pawn on e3 and put the bishop on a7, and now we can go in between, and now this is not a skewer anymore. This is a double attack, or if you want to call it a fork, we could call it a fork. We've got the bishop in between the king and the rook, and the bishop is guarded so the king can't take it. Do we need to guard the bishop? Well, we do if the king's only one square away. What if the king's further away? What if the king is on f6 instead of e5, and we still have that bishop on a7? Then now we don't need the bishop to be guarded. because the king can't take it, and now we've got the double attack by being in between. Again, if the bishop were safely able to go to g7, it would be a skewer. We can't go to g8 with a bishop unless we promote a pawn to a bishop, in which case we could just as well get a queen. We can't move the bishop to h8 from any other square, so it's kind of hard to skewer the king and the rook in this position from a bishop on h8. How do I know that? Well, the geometry tells me that there's no way for the bishop to get to h8 from any other square without already being skewering the king and already having the king in check, because the only square a bishop could come from would be g7, unless we use that idea we just talked about, which is to under-promote the pawn, where we go up to h8 here, and we say, oh, I don't need a queen to win the game, I just need a bishop. I'll win your rook, and then with all of these other pieces I have on the board that you don't see, that are along with the missing king, I can checkmate him. But you wouldn't see that very often. And let's put the bishop back on c1 now, and now we can get to this b2 square, and now it's not a double attack, it's not a skewer, it's a pin. And if these are the only pieces on the board, let's say white has a king somewhere, then once we play bishop to b2, we're winning the rook. Are we winning the game? No, because if these are the only pieces on the board, we don't have mating material, but at least we're not losing the game. The rook could have checkmated us if, there was a different position with a rook against the bishops. Most positions with rook against bishop with no other pawns on the board are draws, but there are some positions where the bishop's very awkward and it can be a win. But once we play the bishop here, then we've got our draw. If we had other material on the board, let's say we have a pawn over here, and now we play bishop to b2, well, that's a whole different story. Now we're going to shepherd this pawn up and get a queen against the king, and we're going to win. So we have mating material. And again, the same kind of tactical geometric ideas that existed with the ranks and the files with the rooks and the queens now exist on the diagonals with the bishops and the queen. And again, the queen, let's say we have the queen over here on f2. And he's already in check, so let's put him back on, where would be a good square? Trying to see if there's any square where I can come from. How about g4? If I'm on g4 and I want to win the rook, then I'm going to go to that diagonal and get a double attack. If I was on g1, I could still do the same thing. I could double attack him and win. But I have a second way of winning the rook. Let's put the king, over here on h1. Let's say these are the only pieces on the board. White to play and win. Well, queen to d4 check wins, but I have a second way to win. I could pin him, and again, the king is so far away that I'm winning the rook. Now let's change the position a little bit. If we change the position and put the king on e5, now the geometry says that queen here check doesn't work. Queen here pinning, it's not check. Queen to a1 doesn't work because he can move the king and guard the rook, and I can't win it. Queen to e1 check, double attacks along a diagonal and along a file. We haven't talked about that yet, but then that's another geometry we can talk about. But that doesn't work because the king can move over and guard the rook. So pin doesn't work. Double attack doesn't work. Double attack here, loses the queen. Double attack here, loses the queen. Double attack here, loses the queen. Oh, but here's the skewer again. Skewer. The skewer is good because now the king is, although he's two diagonal squares away from the rook, he can't move along the diagonal and guard the rook. He has to get out of the way, and we win the rook. So in this position, we have double attack that fails, pin that fails. In both cases, the king can guard the rook. We have double attacks on g3, e3, and c5, which are not safe and don't work. But we've got a skewer on g7, so that's the only one that wins the whole rook and wins the game here. So, I mean, you're winning the game anyway if you don't do anything. You don't have to win the rook. You could play queen f2, and the queen and the king beat the king and the rook if you know how to play it right. But if we're talking about white to play and win in the short run, then queen to g7 is our only geometric answer on this. Are you starting to get an idea of what it takes to make it so you win and you don't win? I mean, those are important. All right, so those are the diagonal and the horizontal. And as we just saw with the queen, we can combine them. If we move the king a little further away here, now the geometry tells us we don't have the skewer, we don't have the pin, but we've got a double attack that involves diagonal and vertical on the file. So that works because the king can't move and guard the rook, and the rook can't go in the way. So that's going to be the move that will win the rook. Very often when you have these loose pieces and the board's really open in the endgame and you have a queen, you get a lot of these double attack possibilities all over the board. So it's very important when you have pieces against the queen to make sure that they're guarded or potentially guarded, because otherwise the queen starts jumping around the board with a bunch of moves, forcing you to make king moves that eventually get you into double attacks or maybe even skewers or pins. All right, so that's that. Now, what else can we do? Well, let's take a look at forkable pawn move forks. Pawn move forks are two pieces that are on the same rank. Let's say we'll put a rook here and a knight here. They're two squares apart on the same rank, which means if I have a pawn on e2 or a pawn on e3, I can play e4 and fork the two pieces. And that comes up a lot. So the geometry is two pieces on the same rank that are two files apart are pawn forkable. Let's take an opening where maybe that could happen. Let's do a Sicilian. Let's say we've got an open Sicilian. And if white plays bishop to f4, there's the two pieces that are two files apart on the same rank. That means if we could get a pawn up there, we could get a fork, and voila, there it is, e5, and we fork him. Let's put a little twist on this. Let's say white plays bishop e2 first, and black plays knight c6, and now white plays bishop f4. Does e5 still work? We have the geometry that tells us there's a pawn fork there. Does that work? Does black have a defensive idea that would save the piece if black plays e5 here? A lot of people I've seen in similar positions, they play e5 really quickly here, saying, oh, I have a fork, and then they regret it because after e5, white has a defensive idea. He can take one of those pieces and trade it off for a piece of the same value. And now if black takes the bishop with e takes f4, white's going to take the queen. So black can't do that. He has to recapture the knight first, and that gives white time to save the bishop, and white doesn't lose anything. So white made this terrible move, bishop f4, but black said, oh, I see the geometry, the pieces are two apart, and he jumps on e5, when in fact that doesn't work. What he should do is attract the queen to the d4 square with knight takes d4, and when white recaptures queen takes d4, now he can play e5. And now he's winning a piece. The best white could do is play bishop takes, pawn takes, queen takes check, and now black just gets out of check with bishop e7 or bishop e6 or queen e7, and black's up a piece for two pawns, and he's winning. So the geometry was telling black that this is the right move, but you don't want to play it right away. You want to make sure he doesn't have a move like knight takes c6. So the geometry for the fork was here, but it doesn't work right away. You got to think about it a little bit. You can't just jump on the geometry and take like that. Now we have knight forkable moves as well. Let's clear out the board again. We just looked at pawn forkable, we looked at rook, and we looked at skewers and forks and pins along diagonals. But what about knights? Well, for a knight to be forkable, you need pieces that are apart by the distance that a knight could fork them. So let's put a king over here and a queen over here. Can a knight get to one of these squares and fork him? And the answer is no, the geometry is not there. How can we change the position so it could be there? We can move the queen one closer. Now there's a square where there's a fork. So if we have a knight that's a knight move away from that square, if it's on one of those other squares at the moment, like that, I think I got all 6 of them. If we happen to have a knight over here on g5 and it's white's turn, the queen and the king are knight forkable, and we can play knight there and fork them. I think one of the more famous forks at the start of the game is when the king and the queen rook start the game, they are knight forkable away from each other, which means if you can safely get a knight up to c7 sometime early in the game, that will fork the rook and fork the king, and that makes them knight forkable. So you have to watch out for knight forks on those squares. How else could something like that happen? Well, suppose let's see here. What's a typical thing that might happen? Suppose white black castles. Suppose he has a rook and a rook here, and we'll make it black's move, and he castles. That puts the rook and the rook too far away. They're not knight forkable anymore, and the king's not knight forkable. If black happens to then play a move like rook to e8, well, now the rooks become rook knight forkable on those two squares, and you could do it. Same thing at the start of the game. If the king and the queen are like this, and one of them moves over by a square, let's say the queen goes to c8, that means the king and the queen are not only pawn forkable here on d7, but they're knight forkable on d6. If white can somehow safely get a knight up to d6, these two pieces are knight forkable, and as I said, because they're on the same rank and they're two apart, they're also pawn forkable. So we see these positions. What could any other piece get to them? Sure. We could get a rook skewer on the h8 or g8 square. We could get a rook pin on b8 or a8. For instance, we could guard those squares. Let's put a bishop on the diagonal, and we'll put a rook on b1. I see, oh, it's a pinnable situation. So we could play rook to b8. There's the geometry telling us that maybe we can get something there. We could even do it in between. We could put the bishop on h4 and put the rook on d1 and play rook to d8 check, which is a double attack. And now the queen would have to take, the bishop would take, the king would take, and assuming there's a bunch of other pieces on the board, which there usually are, then you just want a queen for a rook and a bishop, which is, worth more, usually much more than a pawn if we use the Kaufman values for that. How about king forkable? That's a cute one. For instance, let's say there's two knights that are like this. We could actually have a king on either d5 or f7, and we could move our king in between, and we could get a king fork, and we could win one of the knights by playing king to e6. Notice the knights are not in the position where they can guard each other, so therefore I'm winning. Now, if the two knights were like this, which is pawn forkable and knight forkable, but of course you can't fork the two knights with a knight, wouldn't work, but they are king forkable. We could bring the king in from, let's say, f5 or d5 and fork them, but this doesn't win because now the knights are on the geometry that says the knights can move and guard each other. So either knight could now move to e5. So in this position, the knights are king forkable, but they're not as vulnerable because they can move and guard each other. If we change the position a little bit and put the knights like this, then let's say, I'm just trying to figure out how this could work. I'm trying to move my king. Let's say this knight just checked the king on f5. Let's say the knight came from c8. And the knight says, all right, it's my move. I'm going to play knight to e7 check. And white says, oh, look, I've got two hanging knights that are king forkable on those squares. I can play king to e6 and hit both knights, and the knights can't move to guard each other. So I'm going to be winning the knight with the king double attack. So we've looked at double attacks with the rook and the queen along a vertical horizontal line, a rank or file. We've looked at queen and bishops along a diagonal. We've looked at queens combining the horizontal vertical with the diagonal. We've looked at knight forkable geometries. We've looked at pawn forkable geometries. Now we're looking at king forkable geometries. So these are all patterns. Let's take a look at a game that a student played where he allowed one of these geometries and he ended up losing because he didn't realize he was creating his own seeds. And these are the kind of things that keep your rating closer to 1,000 than let's say 1,600 or 1,700. All right, let's bring up this position. Okay, so in this game, White has just moved his knight to e4, attacking the black queen. What the black queen should probably do is go back to e7, but White wanted to play aggressively and keep attacking that pawn on f3, so White played queen to f5. This geometry is not very good because not only is the queen and the bishop blocking each other along the diagonal, yes, they form a battery, but that battery is pretty weak, but also the queen is running out of safe squares, so that my geometry tells me that there's not a lot of squares around where the queen is moving that the queen can safely go. All right, but right now black is okay, but that queen move to f5, that aggressive move, is actually a little bit dangerous from the geometry standpoint. So White plays rook to b1 because his bishop was hanging on b2, and now White castles, and that sets up another geometry. There's the diagonal. We got a king and a bishop and a queen all on that diagonal, which says to White and to black, maybe later White could get a queen or a bishop onto that diagonal and maybe do something. Not now maybe, but maybe later. So we'll see exactly what happens in the game. White decides to bring his bishop back to guard some of those squares that the queen could go to, with an idea of maybe getting to trap the queen sometime. White plays h5, maybe to stop the white pawn from coming up, but probably not his best move. He could have created a good geometric idea by moving the king away from that diagonal. White then develops the bishop to d2, doesn't do much, and now black should start fixing those problems. He should move the king off the diagonal. He could move his rook to the middle and guard that bishop. Instead, he unguards his bishop on e6. Well, you might say, who cares? Nobody's attacking it, and the queen and the bishop are guarding each other. And now White basically holds up a big sign and says to black, well, yes, but now I could play h4, and that will let my rook on h1 guard the bishop on h3. The bishop on h3, I couldn't do that before because the pawn was in the way for guarding the rook, but now the rook can guard it. And if black does nothing, let's say if black plays king to b8, White can play bishop h3 and skewer the queen and the bishop. And notice the queen has no squares along the diagonal or along any line that would guard the bishop on e6, and that would lose the bishop. But even worse things happen. Instead of moving the king out of the way and losing the bishop, black did not pay attention to the seeds here. He played hope chess and moved his bishop off the diagonal, exposing the queen and the bishop to the diagonal, and now you've got the exact thing we were talking about earlier in the video of potential pins of the queen to the king. And White played bishop h3, of course, pinned the queen to the king, and won. These tactics don't just happen. All the seeds of destruction were there. The loose pieces, the unguarding of the bishop, the keeping the king and the queen on the same line, moving the queen in such a way. And then White was basically holding up a big sign when he played h4 that, oh, I'd like to play bishop h3, but it wasn't guarded, and now it is. So he was telling black what he was doing, and black, unfortunately, was playing hoop chess and didn't pay attention. But when you make mistakes like this, and you listen to this kind of video, you understand how these tactics didn't just happen, but they got set up by black by making a lot of geometrically bad moves, a lot of moves that unguarded his pieces, setting things up along that diagonal. So from a very practical standpoint, from the rest of our video, we see an example of how that can work in a game. All right, again, please tell your friends about my channel. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you want to like it, great. If you want to tell your friend, if you want to subscribe to the channel, you can do that too. We'll see you next time. Thanks a lot. Bye.